This morning we are pleased to be joined by our society leader, Hugh Taft-Morales, who will explore the principles held by our ethical humanist movement that relate to reproductive justice. Leader Hugh, please approach the podium.
Good morning. Before I dive into my talk, a few caveats like I like to say. First of all, I'm going to be speaking a lot today about the right to choose. And I want to keep in mind, though, that reproductive justice is broader than that. And so we always have to keep fighting for all forms of reproductive justice, including healthy checkups, prenatal care, screenings, fertility treatment, so that women who want to bring a child into the world are supported. Secondly, I'm going to be speaking a lot today, and sometimes I'll be using the terms men and women. And I want to emphasize that there is a broad spectrum of sexual identities and physical manifestations of sexuality, and in this light, anyone, I think, that wants to have a biological child, whether they identify as man, woman, or non-binary, should be supported in that effort, or to control their reproductive justice in general. So here's what I'm going to conclude today. I'm going to conclude that given the assault on reproductive rights of anyone with a uterus, we have to have a broad strategy to attack our opponents. We have to defend reproductive choice in as many ways as possible. I'm going to go over some of those. But also we should consider on whether or not we should defend reproductive rights as an expression of our commitment to ethical culture. To embrace it as something that is in our religious liberty to demand choice. And in a country where religious conservatives are citing their faith to advance their agenda, maybe we should do the same. All right, let me start with some historical backdrop. 1965, Griswold versus Connecticut. The Supreme Court ruled that the 1879 law criminalizing advocating contraception was unconstitutional. A few years later, in Roe v. Wade in 73, the court cited the 14th Amendment's due process clause in asserting a woman's right to privacy, and that gave her significant authority over her own body. Now, almost immediately, Roe v. Wade was controversial. The controversy kept growing for decades. In fact, halfway back to then, in 1997, Carl Sagan and Ann Druyan wrote, "The issue has been decided years ago. The court had taken a middle ground. You'd think the fight was over. Instead, there are mass rallies, bombings and intimidation, murders of workers at abortion clinics, arrests, intense lobbying, legislative drama, congressional hearings, Supreme Court decisions, major parties almost defining themselves on the issue, and clerics threatening politicians with perdition. Partisans fleeing accusations of hypocrisy and murder. The intent of the Constitution and the will of God are equally invoked. Doubtful arguments are trotted out as certitudes. Amid all the shouting, it's hard for the adversaries to hear one another. Opinions are polarized. Minds are closed." It's like that now, for sure. We have to have open minds, and we have to deal with polarization, but I find it hard to compromise on the right to control one's own body. So, to defend the right to choose, let me explore some of the strategies that I think we have to confront on the anti-choice side. So, coming from those opposing the right to control your body, those anti-choice extremists have an incredible array of strategies. One of the most effective was about how the issue is framed. The right has done a good job of framing the issue. Immediately after Roe v. Wade, anti-choicers began to adopt the term pro-life. Then they replaced the term fetus which was the vocabulary used in Roe v. Wade with the term unborn child. And this led to more laws against fetal abuse. Even though Roe defined the fetus as a non-person, courts began to allow for suits based on prenatal child abuse. And these are continuing. This pushed the public dialogue away from the rights of women. Personal reproductive decisions were politicized. Rosalind Pachetsky, author of Abortion and Women's Choice, wrote that when the privacy curtain was pulled away, women began losing ownership of the birth process. They became invisible and objectified and more subject to control of the state. Pachetsky said that the right wing managed to, quote, deprivatize the womb. It is no longer a woman's private space, and she is no longer the only or even the main patient in an obstetrical situation. So without the private space, without the sanctuary that Roe had carved out, extremists started to gain power. And that's part of a broader strategy to deny women the right to define their sexuality generally. Reactionary preachers began to assert, and had for a long time, but re-emphasized that a woman's role is to give birth. That was their argument. Pachetsky noticed the persistence of the, quote, Augustinian image of the woman as ordained by God to procreate, the passive receptacle of the male seed, selfish and sinful as she evades that destiny and directs her sexuality to non-procreative ends. Now that reminds me of the misogynist fascism portrayed in Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale, right? Women are forced in that horror to carry children for the good of the state. Offred, the main protagonist, speaks about how stunned she was at how quickly this all occurred. It was hard to believe, the entire government gone like that. How did they get in? How did it happen? That was when they suspended the Constitution. They said it would be temporary. Now today, those who speak out for choice or choose to bring a child to term or to terminate a pregnancy, when they choose to terminate pregnancies, they're labeled evil, corrupted, untrustworthy. One state legislature argued that the fetus was, quote, virginal and pure, whereas he defined the woman as demanding an abortion as morally culpable for having, quote, gotten herself pregnant. They're painted as selfish and callous, and this has legal ramifications. Deborah Rowland, in her book, The Boundaries of Her Body, wrote that one Philadelphia Superior Court panel heard a malpractice case of a woman suing a doctor for a miscarriage. Now, the doctor's lawyer said that the woman did not care about human life because she had had an abortion earlier in her life. And the jury agreed. This horrible claim saying that the plaintiff, quote, placed so little value on the fetus that her level of emotional distress would not be the same as that of a woman who valued the fetus all through the pregnancy and never contemplated an abortion at any stage. Now that is diabolical reasoning and legally effective. Such oversimplifications denying women the right to manage their own lives. Now, in the New York Times, Christina Locke wrote an op-ed discussing how this shift in language made liberals even uncomfortable in discussing abortion or sexuality as a whole. She said, we went from basking in the rights that feminism had afforded us to silently pledging never to exercise them. Nice mommies don't talk about abortion, end quote. Anti-choice activists, on the other hand, scream outside of Planned Parenthood clinics with a righteous certainty that has translated into effectiveness at the ballot box. So conservative forces have been able to push 4 presidents, Reagan, both Bushes, Trump, to take anti-abortion stances. But since most Americans, by a large number, support reproductive choice, they began to attack on a state-by-state basis. That was about 20 years when they came up with that strategy. Charmaine Yost, who's the former executive of Americans United for Life, put it this way: "For us, it's very much a military strategy. Never attack where the enemy is strongest. We pick our battles. What we do is very much under the radar screen." And that was back in 2000, when anti-choice forces began to overwhelm state houses across the country with restrictive laws on choice. And that continues today. In North Dakota, the governor there said that his state's abortion ban was an attempt to discover the boundaries of Roe v. Wade. That was a few years ago. Arkansas has adopted one of the most restrictive bans on abortion. And just recently, tens of thousands of low-income women in Texas have been denied reproductive health care because the state cut off funding for Planned Parenthood, and on and on and on. Now, these state-by-state efforts were destructive, but what was worse, I think, in the long run, was that their efforts drove many people to the polls, and that got Trump elected. And when he took office, before that, the Senate unethically denied the rights of the Supreme Court, denied the rights of President Obama to appoint his Supreme Court justice. I still can't believe that that happened. It was stolen, and it was unconstitutional by any interpretation. So with the addition of Gorsuch and Kavanaugh and Barrett, the court became hostile to women's reproductive rights. Now, 7 of the justices are Catholic, with only one being a liberal Catholic, Sotomayor. And the U.S. Catholic of bishops have long been calling for a constitutional amendment to ban abortion, but the Supreme Court made that pretty unnecessary as it sacrificed women's rights at the altar of religious extremism. And that's what it is. It is religious extremism. Now, if that's not bad enough, this reactionary wave against women's rights to choose actually is part of a much broader framework called Project 2025. How many of you have heard of this? Project 2025. This is a project by the Heritage Institute and about 80 other organizations. Now, the Heritage Institute used to be a mainstream conservative group. They drove me crazy enough 30 years ago, but now they have drifted to become anti-democratic and extreme. And Project 2025 includes authoritarian efforts to politicize independent institutions, spread disinformation, centralize executive power, deconstruct checks and balances, squash all dissent, marginalize the rights of certain communities, corrupt elections, damage faith in elections, and stoke violence. Now, regarding reproductive justice, they're focusing on banning the abortion pills and stripping away funding for reproductive choices. And these efforts go beyond the United States. Project 2025 is reaching all over the world to do this. They have worked with governments, conservative governments in Brazil and Hungary, Egypt, Indonesia, Uganda, about a dozen others, to basically condemn all forms of global reproductive aid. And for many of these women who are in places where patriarchy reigns, they are being denied reproductive services. And these are primarily offered by USAID. All right, so given this incredibly broad movement by extremist right-wing forces, much greater than their actual numbers, but still even there, very scary, I think we have to broaden our strategies as well. We have to have many, many ways we're pushing forward. So let's look what this looks like. Framing, the words we're using. I think we should take a page out of the right-wing playbook by defining our terms and repeating and repeating and repeating and repeating. Emphasize words, for example, like choice, privacy, liberty, doctor-patient confidentiality, family planning, keeping the government out of the bedroom, no policeman between a woman and her doctor. There's lots more. What is the language that is going to best put forward our case? Learn, disseminate, and share information about all of this. Explore the websites of Planned Parenthood or the Center for Reproductive Rights or NARA. Now, if you speak up more, do so with people that you know, family members, friends, colleagues, take the risk about forcing them to talk about the importance of reproductive healthcare services. Have people that have influence invited into a conversation, your local politicians. Write an op-ed, post online. If there's a story in the Inky, write a letter to the editor the next day, pushing your view forward for pro-choice. Speaking up does more than just advance a political agenda. It lowers the shame and the stigma that is heaped on anybody seeking reproductive services. Because we still carry the burden of our puritanic past, where we don't want to talk about anything having to do with the body, let alone pleasure. And that's damaging reproductive choice. So, support the physical and mental health of those who are seeking and offering reproductive health care. The doctors are under great stress. So, volunteer on the ground. Many of you I know have. My wife regularly volunteers with Planned Parenthood down in DC, and her job is just to walk with people from their car or from the metro into the building so that she can distract them and support them as the anti-choicers are shouting these horrible things. She finds it incredibly ugly what they will say, heaping abuse of all sorts, for most women coming for something other than abortion services. There is great potential for physical violence. As I read that list about what was happening years ago, we have to demand that the Department of Justice robustly enforce the Freedom of Access to Clinic Entrances Act. The fact that we had to pass a specific law for that, it helps people who are accessing and providing reproductive services to be protected from physical violence. Because the paramilitary groups on the right are continuing to arm and become more active and emboldened. We also have to protect healthcare information. This is something that is under-focused on. So there's the Reproductive Health Privacy Act under HIPAA that we need to make sure the DOJ enforces, because it helps basically investigate and sue and prosecute people who steal health information and then use it to intimidate or threaten. On the political front, tell your elected officials to speak out more, to make public policy statements that lowers the shame and stigma and demands the rights of reproductive services. And when they do speak out, thank them. And then thank them again when they turn their words into legislative action. Tell them to appoint people who have a long record of defending reproductive rights. Demand the Department of Justice defend the Reproductive Rights Task Force, which monitors the infringement of federal protections for reproductive health care. In other words, the states are ignoring federal law. The DOJ and the Food and Drug Administration have to also protect access to abortion medication. For example, mifepristone is a very effective and safe drug that was just recently, CVS and Walgreens give them a shout out and said they're going to provide this medication for people. There are outdated restrictions in many states that are keeping that medicine from being available. And there are things like the Emergency Medical Treatment and Labor Act. That was passed because when women, for example, are in a car accident and a doctor is trying to save her life, if she is currently, if she is carrying a fetus, the doctor can be sued for the fetus dying even though all he was trying to do was save the life of the mother. So there are all these ways that doctors are looking over their shoulders to make sure they're not going to get sued. And HHS has to affirm that that is the right of the doctors to first save the right of the life of the mother. Now, the government also has to assure that the funding is available across all types of insurance. So beginning with private insurance to make sure that they offer reproductive service coverage. There's new guidance from the Departments of Treasury and Labor and Health and Human Services that assures that FDA-approved medications and contraceptions are available at no cost under the Affordable Care Act. We need to promote that information and make sure that that's being followed. The law also mandates that private health plans offer family planning counseling at no out-of-pocket cost. Millions of women have benefited from these services so far, and we need to continue with that. The VA, the Veterans Administration, has to be supported. It has commitments to provide abortion counseling and in some cases abortion care to veterans and VA beneficiaries. The Department of Justice has to defend them against prosecution and support measures by the Office of Personnel Management, OPM, to strengthen contraception for all federal workers, retirees, and family members. Every one of these is a separate battle because on the other side they're pushing in each of these areas. Medicaid and children's health insurance programs have to carry contraceptives as well, so HHS has to expand and defend those payments. Medicare beneficiaries, same thing. And even most importantly, for those that are pushed underneath the poverty line, which is more and more people every day, Title X clinics are critical. There are 4,000 plus Title X clinics in this country. They offer family planning for low-income people. 2.5 million clients would be burdened if that was cut, because unexpected pregnancies and unsafe and expensive abortion services would be their only choices outside of the coverage. And don't forget the women around the world that are in horribly patriarchal cultures. There's USAID has been fighting back against Trump's gag order. When Trump was in office, he issued a gag order saying that USAID couldn't talk about abortion overseas. And although that no longer is the law of the land, Biden ended that, client countries and people are still afraid that that's going to happen, so they're not doing it. So we have to push to make sure that people around the world, especially in poorer countries, know they can access and get USAID funded aid. Maybe you don't have time enough to do each one of those battles. If you don't have the time, contribute financially to organizations. There are many of them that are available. Look into which ones support what you believe is most important to give women the rights to control their bodies. There's a list on the ACLU website that's a very good list of various organizations you can support. And millions of dollars are pouring in to the right-wing extremists at this time. So we do have to counter that with funding. All right. What I want to spend the rest of the time talking about is discussing this question. Should we advance arguments that assert reproductive rights as an expression of our religious freedom? As humanists, as ethical humanists, should we say, this is what we demand as an example of our religious freedom? I mean, right-wing activists, as we all know, are imposing their narrow and intolerant viewpoints on us in order to deny right to choose. So should we do the same with our own sense of religious conviction? Many Jewish leaders have had success. There are a number of suits currently going on where Judaism is consistently saying that personhood begins at birth. So that's a whole argument that we could take on. There's no such thing as an unborn person in the Jewish tradition. Restrictions on abortion violate the religious freedom of many Jews. And so this recent absurd ruling in Alabama declaring that frozen embryos are people prompted the Shalom Center to write, "This weekend's decision from Alabama's highest court classifying frozen embryos as children is wildly outrageous and sets a harmful precedent that violates separation of church and state." It points out how the court didn't hide its Christians' belief. Many of you might have read this. They were constantly citing the Bible. The court decision, they mentioned God 41 times in that decision. And it was a Christian God, very clearly. One member of the Philly Ethical Society, many of you know Dr. Zia Okocha. She's told me that it's not just in the South and in certain areas of the country, all over the country this is happening. She was a doctor in Indiana helping to provide reproductive health care services. She moved from Indiana because she feared for her personal safety and her professional career. She just recently resettled in Maryland. Now the ACLU, she said, is defending people in Indiana fighting against a lawsuit there, basically saying that banning abortions violates Jewish teaching that, quote, a fetus attains the status of a living person only at birth. Ken Falk, who is their state legal director, explained that these restrictions on abortion services and legal threats violate religious freedom. He said, Jewish law stresses the necessity of protecting the life and the physical and mental health of the mother prior to birth, as the fetus is not yet deemed to be a person, end quote. In 1922, an abortion ban was passed by the Indiana GOP's dominated legislature and signed by the governor there. And the ACLU opposed that, saying, look at a law that Mike Pence signed when he was governor. It's ironic. He signed a law that was intended to protect individual religious liberty. Pence warned that any law that substantially burdens any person's following their religious belief was unconstitutional. Now, Pence was aiming mainly to keep companies who wanted to deny their services to gay or queer folks. That's why he used that, to protect the bakers and other people who didn't want to provide services. But it can also be used, according to the ACLU, to support religious views that embrace the right to choose. So that's a strategy that we might consider. Because Islamic groups, Episcopalian churches, the Unitarian Universalist faith, and even some pagan groups have similar claim to religious freedom being a way to defend reproductive choice. Now, one of the more colorful and federally recognized non-theistic non-traditional groups is the Satanic Temple. How many of you know the Satanic Temple? Right. Don't worry, they have nothing to do with Satan, actually. Their name is an attention-grabbing sort of marketing ploy, okay? This is a group that was founded in 2013, and it embraces benevolence and empathy and opposes the intrusion of government Christian values into American politics, the intrusion of extremist Christian values into American politics. So one of its central tenets is, quote, one's body is inviolable, subject to one's will alone. Central religious tenet of the Satanic Temple. This religious belief has been used in legal battles against medically unnecessary and unscientific regulations that inhibit access to abortion services. The Satanic Temple opposes, quote, waiting periods, mandatory viewings of sonograms, and compulsory counseling that deny the rights and violate the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. So a year ago, Zia wrote to me and asked me, is there any way that ethical culture could defend abortion rights by citing our religious convictions? I thought it was possible because ethical culture has a long history of defending reproductive freedom. The American Ethical Union has passed 7 resolutions. The first one was in 1958, the last one in the 90s, defending reproductive rights. Seems like it's time for another one. But there are a lot of elements in ethical culture that could support religious freedom, basing it on our faith, if you want to use that term. Now, many of us are drawn to devotion to science and evidence, so similar to the arguments put forward by Jewish legal experts, there's no single point where human life jumps into existence, contrary to what some want to claim. Ethical culture leader Judith Erickson, who just died 2 months ago, wrote about abortion rights, and she said, some people seem to think that the issue rests on the question of when life begins. My answer is that life began about 4 billion years ago, give or take a few. It has continued in one unbroken unity ever since. Life is one stream without a beginning that is meaningful to us and without an end so far on this planet. This is a fact discoverable by science. Now, something similar can be argued about human life, not just life in general. There's no moment when a human being simply comes to existence. At one point, viability outside of the womb was claimed. Other people, they said quickening, conception, obviously. But technology changes all of that. And it makes some of the claims of this moment absurd. So, like if I clip my fingernail and throw it away, am I guilty of murder because there's a potential cloning potential there? So nobody can say absolutely or authoritatively when a ball of human cells becomes a person. And this challenges the claim that human life begins at some point that the state can come in and enforce. But I think that there are better ways that we can offer religious arguments, okay? Because that whole thing about when life begins becomes a very complicated argument. And I think there are clearer ways that we can demand reproductive services based on ethical culture. One comes from the second of the 8 commitments of ethical culture. I don't talk a lot about the 8 commitments. It was a document produced a few years ago, but the second one is this. Ethics begins with choice. Creating a more humane environment begins by affirming the need to make significant choices in our lives. This aligns with our community's respect for autonomy and self-determination. And it leads me to believe that the individual with the womb should have the right to control that womb. Not their partner, not their doctor, not a judge. Judith Exton pointed out that this emphasis on choice is why we teach our children to be responsible for thinking and acting based on the best evidence possible, right? We want them to choose. She wrote that we need to, quote, teach children that there will arise new ethical problems and they will need to make new decisions. Our religious view is quite different from those who teach belief and obedience. We are skeptical of revelation if it is somebody else's. This brings the obligation to learn for ourselves values and facts and to make decisions. The right to choose is fundamental to ethical humanism. So too, I think, is the right to privacy. That's part of our ethical culture history. The leader, Kurt Collier, pointed me to page 157 of the Reconstruction of the Spiritual Ideal. And at that page, Felix Adler, who founded ethical culture, argues that personal and familial sovereignty, quote, is sacrosanct against outside interference. And that declaration aligns with the right to privacy that Roe promoted. Although it proved to be a weak constitutional defense, it is an ethically powerful defense. And I think we need legislation to make it firm. Besides, our national story is all about personal liberty, right? Something that most conservatives usually agree with in principle, but refuse to apply to reproductive choice. The argument that I think is most powerful, but maybe it's muddy, but I really hold it to heart, is the centrality of relationships in ethical culture. We are about creating relationships that are open, candid, and supportive. We believe that relationships help make us up who we are. They constitute us. I've always been attracted to that idea in ethical culture. Sure, I'm an individual, but I'm also a father. I'm also a husband. I'm also an ethical culture leader, a singer, a Phillies fan. But those relationships are not separate from me. They are who I am. Our relationships make us up who we are. And these, to me, are very, very important when we talk about the right to choose. So the woman who wrote the book I mentioned earlier, Pachetsky, reflects this. She says, what it means to be a human involves an irreducible social and relational basis without which the very concept of humanity makes no sense. It is this relationships, this interdependence, that humanizes us. And what we're seeing is the dehumanization of women and anyone who wants to have a child across the country. Often the fetus is held as distinct from and superior to the woman. But motherhood is about relationship and intimacy and identity. This is what I've been told by the women closest to me in my life who have had children. Pachetsky explains, reducing motherhood to a passive biological state is a way of dehumanizing it, stripping it of dependence on women's consciousness. The right to life position denies the role of human will and judgment in moral decision-making, particularly in decision-making about children and sex. It thus denies the full human personhood of women. That consciousness, emerging out of reciprocal sensory activity, marks the beginning of the social relationships that are necessary and the sole basis through which the fetus's development of a self is its humanization is even possible. Ellen Willis, who was a feminist writer, said that the process of birth can't be separated from the consciousness of the woman. But that's what the law is trying to do from the extremist position. Willis says, there is no way a pregnant woman can passively let the fetus live. She must create and nurture it with her own body, a symbiosis that is often difficult, sometimes dangerous, and uniquely intimate. This relationship that can grow between a mother and what may become a child is unique to that woman. It's intimate, it's private, and I would even say sacred. Maybe that word has too much spiritual or religious resonance for you, but it's as close as I can come to imagine a sacred relationship. No outside authority should deny the woman's right to control her own body and this most personal process. So for those of us without a uterus, we're always going to view human reproduction from a vantage less intimate than those who experience it because they bring a child into the world or carry a fetus. Life involves this deep and unique and personal relationship that, to me, forces us to confront the fact that the right to privacy and autonomy and reproductive choice has to be defended vigorously. So let's continue to fight for reproductive rights, learn, speak out. Men in particular should stand in solidarity, I think. Support groups like NARAL or Planned Parenthood. Humanists who embrace choice and autonomy and relationships should work to recommit ourselves as a nation to a woman's right to choose. Thanks very much, everybody.